The opening of the aria O tu Palermo from Verdi's I Vespri Siciliani, sung by Ezio Pinza, the Italian bass who managed to achieve undisputed supremacy in two very different worlds, those of international opera and of the Broadway musical.
It was just a glorious experience being with him on stage because he gave you so much. Beyond the singing, which was unbelievably warm and huge and just enveloped you. He enveloped you with his personality, which was overwhelming. I've never known anyone like him.
He was a gigantic presence, really. He also had that star quality that if he made a mistake, he made it with such authority that it seemed right. He really was terrific.
He had a very special stamp kind of voice that you could not question even who it was. It was Ezio. It had a very dark sound, and yet it could have a very soft bass sound, it always had a lusciousness about it.
I remember seeing him a week or two before the first night of South Pacific, and he really was jittery, because it was either going to be a fantastic success or it was going to be a failure. It was, of course, one of the greatest successes in all Broadway history. I mean, he hit Broadway like an atom bomb. The kind of people who usually went to a musical, of course, never seen anything like this marvelous-looking creature with his terrific voice. And the Pinza fever grew to such a point that if he went into a restaurant, the women used to stand up and cheer.
South Pacific came towards the end of Pinza's long and extraordinary career, a journey which took him far from his beginning in Rome. He was born there on May the 18th, 1892, into a working-class family. His parents wanted him to be christened Ezio, but their local priest pointed out that as the original Ezio had been a pagan Roman general, the name would not be smiled on by Mother Church. So they backed down and settled for the name Fortunato, though the boy was universally known as Ezio. When Pinza was 2 years old, his father, who was a carpenter, took his family off to live in Ravenna, and during his childhood Ezio used to help him with odd jobs, as well as picking up a bit of extra pocket money with errands such as delivering bread for the local bakery. As he grew older and stronger, he graduated to work on the railway, before attempting his first real ambition, to be a racing cyclist. His father, who was illiterate but worldly wise, later described his son as having covered a lot of ground, achieved a muscular figure, and never won a race. Whether Pinza was discouraged by this lack of success, I don't know. But in any case, as it gradually became evident that he possessed a more than usually attractive voice, he decided to change tack and presented himself for an audition at the Conservatory in Bologna. He did so with considerable diffidence, because unlike so many of the other great Italian singers, such as Caruso, Gigli, Schipa, and De Luca, Pinza had not been to a choir school, and for him music was uncharted territory. Nevertheless, he managed to win a scholarship, and his teacher, Alessandro Vezzani, magnanimously waived his fees until Pinza should be able to reimburse him from his earnings, a debt which, in due course, Pinza was happy to discharge. After only 2 years, he was considered ready to make his debut, and in the little town of Soncino, near Cremona, he appeared as the first of what was to become an imposing roll call of operatic high priests. Oroveso, the archdruid, in Bellini's Norma.
nemico, è sempre il cielo, oh consiglio il simular.
I don't suppose that at the tender age of 22, Pinza had been able to stamp quite that degree of assurance onto his impersonation of the Archdruid. The recording, one of his first, was made 7 years later. But the debut went well enough to bring in several more contracts, one indeed in the important city of Palermo. But it was 1914, and his next engagement, like it or not, was with an artillery regiment serving on the Alpine front. 6 years were lost before he could discard his uniform and resume his career. But from then onwards all was plain sailing, or as plain as anything ever is in the somewhat hectic world of opera. Pinza was engaged as a company member of the Teatro Costanzi in Rome, where he was able to concentrate on building up a repertoire. Such was his success that only 2 years later Toscanini brought him to La Scala Milan, and within a very few seasons he was in virtually universal demand. The music critic Desmond Shaw Taylor remembers hearing him in the very first Maggio Musicale in Florence.
He was an impressive figure on stage, and in addition he had this very beautiful, rounded, clear, mellow, true Italian bass, which one didn't hear all that often, and without the slightest suggestion of shouting, which Italian basses and baritones are rather given to when other means fail. So that was a great impact.
The role he sang was Sir George Walton in I Puritani, Bellini's tale of the English Civil War, and another of Pinza's early acoustic recordings, made in 1924, amply demonstrates the qualities Desmond Shaw Taylor mentioned. It's the aria Cinta di Fiori, in which Sir George describes the tragic circumstances of his niece's decline into insanity, and it's sung with a smoothness and purity of line to satisfy the most demanding hankerer after the good old days of bel canto. With his noble declamation of the text, the subtle changes of colour in his voice, and the sincerity of his concern in phrases such as "La misera morrà, morrà d'amore," the poor girl will die of love, he presents a restrained and dignified picture of a good man in distress.
E va cantando il giuro, poi grida per amor, tutto tremante. Oh, vieni Arturo, oh, vieni Artur. Se me calor qual tortura amorosa, porcate finta d'amor dal sudor,
tall, handsome, and athletic man with unusual talent as an actor and a regal voice under perfect technical control, Pinza clearly had a great deal on his side. The one thing he lacked was a proper musical training, and even at the end of his life, in his show business days, it irked him that a singer like Bing Crosby could pick up a piece of music and sing it, while he had to find a handy pianist to show him how it went. Pinza's strength lay in the fact that he was a highly gifted, instinctive musician. You only have to listen to his phrasing to hear that. And it was also of the greatest possible value to him that in his artistically formative years he had so potent a mentor as Toscanini. As Pinza himself put it, "It's impossible to describe Toscanini's contribution to my development. Suffice it to say that he taught me most of what I know about style in operatic singing. He was a teacher by the grace of God." One work in which Pinza's stylishness is vividly displayed was Verdi's Requiem, in which a middle course has to be steered between the piety of the text and the emotional intensity of so much of the music. Desmond Shaw Taylor again.
He became really the foundation stone of a great many notable performances. And really, I think about the preferred singer of Toscanini when he did it. Pinza, when he sang Confutatis Maledictis, so on, there was an authority and a strength, and yet behind the strength there was always some kind of sweetness. I don't mean to say that the character of the music or the character of the role was made to sound sweet when it wasn't, but somehow there was sweetness in the musical expression, always in the musical sound, in spite of the grandeur of the tone and the phrasing. So the combination of sweetness and grandeur was very, very striking.
Computatis maledictis, domis acribus addictis, vocam cum benedictis. Oro supplex et acclinis, cor contritum quasi cinis, gere curam mei finis, oro supplex et acclinis, cor contritum quasi cinis. Gere curam mei finis, computatis maledictis, domis acribus addictis, vocam cum benedictis, vocam cum benedictis, vocam cum benedictis. Oro supplex et acclinis, cor contritum quasi cinis, gere curam mei finis, oro supplex et acclinis, cor contritum quasi cinis, gere curam
Religious or regal solemnity is, of course, very often the lot of the operatic bass, and Pinza made his debut at the Metropolitan Opera in 1926 as another of his high priests, this time in Spontini's La Vestale. It would, however, be totally misleading to build up a picture of Pinza as a remorselessly sombre individual. Nothing could be further from the truth, and we are brought closer by far to the real-life personality of Ezio Pinza when he indulges in this sort of amorous Mediterranean outburst. Tosti's L'ultima canzone.
M'han detto che domani Nina vi fate sposa ed io vi canto ancor la serenata. Là nei deserti piani, là nella valle ombrosa, o quante volte a voi l'ho ricantato. O quante volte l'ho ricantata. Fiore d'amaranto, se ti fai sposo, io ti sto sempre accanto. Se ti fai sposa, io ti sto sempre accanto. Ma sempre notte e giorno, piena di passione, verrà gemendo a voi la mia canzone. Verrà gemendo la mia canzone. Fiore di granato, Nina rammenta i baci che t'ho dato. Nina rammenta i baci che t'ho dato.
When the Metropolitan Opera announced in 1929 that Ezio Pinza was to undertake the role of Mozart's Don Giovanni, there was much shaking of heads. It's a baritone role, people said, and if it's sung by a bass, the Don becomes too satanic a figure and the whole balance of the ensemble is disturbed. What the objectors overlooked, though, was that Pinza possessed to a rare degree that elusive quality charisma. And it was that which made the role for 2 decades virtually Pinza's private property. This is nicely illustrated in the memoirs of Bruno Walter. In 1934 he was due to conduct the Salzburg Festival's first Italian-language production of Don Giovanni, and he'd insisted that the title role should be taken by a singer who possessed, as Walter puts it, that immediately convincing personal fascination which is an essential of the part. During the planning stages, Walter happened to be in New York, and at the suggestion of one of the Met's conductors, he invited Pinza round to his house. We'd taken with us to New York, Walter continues, our Bohemian cook, an efficient but quite unimaginative middle-aged person. There was a ring, and Anita went to answer it. She came running back, flushed, confused, and excited, and whispered to my wife, "Ma'am, there's such a beautiful man outside." I said to my wife, "I think I've found my Don Giovanni for Salzburg." I had.
Vieni alla finestra, oh mio tesoro, vieni a consolar il pianto mio. Se neghi a me di dar qualche ristoro, davanti agli occhi tuoi morir voglio. Tu c'hai la bocca dolce più del miele, tu che il zucchero porti in mezzo al cuore. Non esser gioia mia con me crudele, lasciati alla mena vedere mio bell'amore.
Lest anyone should suppose that the Pinza magic only worked on middle-aged Bohemian cooks, here is the great American mezzo-soprano Rhys Stevens, herself one of the most glamorous figures at the Met in the 1930s, 40s and 50s.
There wasn't anything that he could not do on the stage. His Don Giovanni, I think, has never been surpassed. I don't care how many Don Giovannis I've ever heard. There was something very, very special about his. He had enormous sex appeal. When he would walk on the stage, and he knew it, when he would walk on the stage, he would have a swagger that was all Ezio. The women just swooned. I mean, they just adored him from a physical standpoint, not even opening his mouth.
Obviously, there was a great deal more to Pinza's artistry than mere personal magnetism. You don't get by with people like Toscanini and Bruno Walter on charm alone.
Conductors, I understand, adored him. They could manipulate Ezio because vocally he could do practically anything with that voice. He was a bass, but he had very often a baritone sound in the top. Although it was a very voluptuous voice, and that it was, I don't believe an orchestra ever could cover that voice. I don't care how forte they would play. It had a piercing sound. It could ride above an orchestra of any volume. He could sing piano, and he could do phrasings that were just magnificent to listen to. I used to be mesmerized by certain phrases that he would sing with me, especially in Mignon.
Le vieillit s'éveille sous ses aînés doigts, peu semble aux merveilles répondre à sa voix. Légères hirondelles, oiseaux légères hirondelles. Envolez-vous, les beaux ailes, envolez-vous, légères hirondelles. Ouvrez vos ailes, envolez-vous, adieu, adieu.
Fuyez la lumière, fuyez là-bas vers l'horizon vermeil. La première qui rêvera demain le pays de soleil.
Adieu, légères hirondelles, oiseaux bénis de Dieu. Ouvrez, ouvrez vos ailes, envolez-vous, adieu, envolez-vous. Ouvrez vos ailes, envolez-vous, légères hirondelles. Ouvrez vos ailes, envolez-vous, adieu, adieu, légères hirondelles, oiseaux bénis de Dieu, adieu. Ouvrez, ouvrez vos ailes, envolez-vous, adieu, adieu.
The duet Légères Hirondelles from Ambroise Thomas Mignon, sung by Ezio Pinza and Rhys Stevens. And Patrice Mansell, the youngest singer ever to be engaged in a principal role at the Met, was equally delighted to find herself in the same cast as Pinza.
I had just gotten my contract the year before when I was 17, and of course I had heard about Ezio Pinza almost all my life. So when I saw him, he was more than I could ever have imagined, because he was so beautiful and so tall and so handsome. And then we did Tales of Hoffmann together, and I was supposed to run to the back of the stage after having sung way down in the front, run to the back of the stage, and I had twirled myself back to the back, doing a lot of coloratura cadenzas. And then when I got to the very back of the stage, I was supposed to run again down to the front of the stage and reappear singing more coloratura cadenzas. And the distance between the back of the stage and the old Met in the front was horrendous. And I found that every time I got to the front of the stage to do this during rehearsals, I was out of breath. And I was in very good shape, and still am, I guess, but I was tired. So Ezio said he would pick me up at the back of the stage the moment I came off, and he would carry me down to the front of the stage so I could make the entrance without being breathless. Well, my dear, to be picked up in the arms of that glorious man, and I just wished always that it had been a little longer, and I wished that I had been a little older and not quite so naive, because I didn't realize how flirtatious he was and what it could all lead to, which could have been quite marvelous. Anyway, I adored him from that moment on. I just adored him.
The extent to which the ladies tended to adore Ezio Pinza used to keep his name fairly regularly in the newspapers. When he undertook a joint concert tour of Australia with the German soprano Elisabeth Rydberg, followed by a nationwide tour of the United States, his first wife brought a suit for $250,000 against her, well over £1 million today, for alienation of affection. Signora Pinza was eventually persuaded to withdraw her allegations, but the marriage didn't survive. Sometime later, a Californian beauty tried to sue Pinza for breach of promise, and when she filed for damages of only $200,000, the press had some fun conjecturing why the market in Ezio Pinza's heart should have suffered a 20% reduction. Once again, his lawyer managed to talk him out of trouble. "It's Mr. Pinza's Italian background," he explained. "Sometimes people think he's being romantic when he's just being gentlemanly." The gossip columnist Luella Parsons, referring to the crowds of ecstatic youngsters who used to picket the stage door on Don Giovanni nights, came up with the dubious compliment, "Bobby Sockers have discovered in Met bass Ezio Pinza the Frank Sinatra of long-hair music." National polls rated him one of the 10 best-dressed men in the United States and one of the 14 most glamorous men in the world. And Reza Stevens has the clearest memories of the spell he used to weave.
Once he started talking with someone, he had a spark that was very special, very, very special, that everyone felt, especially women felt that very quickly with him. He had wicked eyes that spotted a beautiful woman no matter where, anywhere. He was quite a man.
The American composer and critic Virgil Thompson once described Pinza as the finest singing actor I know. And even without that vibrant physical presence, his records, like this one from Verdi's Hernani, convey the effect. In this scene, Pinza is an elderly Spanish grandee who's just entered his lovely young fiancée's chamber to find her entertaining not just one admirer but two, a bandit leader and the King of Spain, no less. He ranges majestically from outrage to grief and lends dramatic credibility to a scene which could otherwise rather stretch the imagination.
Fra le nevi piomba invece il disonor. Oh, perché l'età del seno, giovine core m'ha serbato. Dovevan gli anni almeno pardigelo ancora il cor, pardigelo ancora il cor, pardigelo ancora il cor. Doveva gli anni almeno pardigelo ancora il cor, ancora il cor. Mi doveva gli anni almeno
To balance the sumptuousness of his lower register, Pinza had a fine ringing top to his voice, and indeed for one recording he assumed the guise of a Verdi baritone. With Elizabeth Reitberg and Beniamino Gigli, he recorded the trio from the last act of Attila, in which he impersonates that self-same Roman general Ezio, after whom he was not allowed to be christened. While the soprano tries to convince the tenor of her love, and the tenor expresses scepticism, understandably, as she's just married Attila the Hun, Ezio urges both of them to stop wasting time on recriminations because there's a battle to be won.
ed oggi ancora da parlare a me, parlare a me, rode non è di lagrime, non di gelosa finché ne arriva il cielo. In serious roles, Pinza's voice always has a wonderful ring of authority to it, and yet he was equally at home in the comic repertoire. When he appeared at Covent Garden as Don Basilio in The Barber of Seville, it was a special gala performance to celebrate King George V's Silver Jubilee in 1935, the critic of the Daily Herald spoke out loud and clear. "One singer stole the show last night," he wrote. "Ezio Pinza as Don Basilio stood head, shoulders and hat above the rest of the cast. Pinza is the greatest Italian singer, comic or serious, who's been heard in London since Battistini." One special gem amongst his recordings from the Buffo repertoire comes from a role he never undertook on stage, Leporello in Don Giovanni. His version of the catalogue aria, recorded in 1946 under the baton of Bruno Walter, indicates what a marvellous Leporello he would have made had he not been the world's favourite Don. He really plays with the text, happily serving up every lascivious little detail, and with a prurient chuckle lurking behind every note. Madamina, il catalogo è questo, delle belle che amo il padron mio, un catalogo che ho fatto io. Osservate, leggete con me, osservate, leggete con me. In Italia 640, in Almagna 231, 100 in Francia, in Turchia 91, ma in Spagna son già 1.300. Van fra questi contadine, cameriere cittadine, van contesse baronesse, marchesine, principesse, e van d'ogni grado, d'ogni forma, d'ogni età. In Italia 640, in Alemagna 231, 100 in Francia, in Turchia 91, ma in Spagna
montagna son già 1.300. 1.300. Ma fra queste contadine, cameriere, cittadine, van contesse, baronesse, marchesine, principesse, e van d'ogni grado, d'ogni forma, d'ogni età, d'ogni forma, d'ogni età, d'ogni forma, d'ogni età.
Once Pinza had become established as a regular at the Met, he made his home in New York, and in 1940 he married an American girl, one of the company's dancers. He seemed so much a part of American musical life that it came as a great shock when, in March 1942, he was arrested by the FBI and interned on Ellis Island as a potentially dangerous enemy alien. He'd apparently been denounced by a colleague for boasting of a personal friendship with Mussolini. Some suspected the jealous machinations of a rival base, others the fury of a soprano scorned. But in any case, he was detained for 11 weeks in the middle of the Met season, and after his release he went out of his way to parade his loyalty to Uncle Sam. He sang for the Treasury Department to promote the sale of war bonds. He posed for pictures to advertise the blood donor service. He was photographed in his car with a sign saying, "I cooperate by not parking in city streets," and on his bicycle announcing that he would be pedaling to save gas. Musically, too, he was happy to absorb some indigenous culture into his concert repertoire.
Holy child walking on dark clouds, thundering, thundering, roll far coming after me. Trudging long down the road, Savior, help me out, my Lord. Here I go, weak and low, wandering, trudging long down the road. Savior, help me out, my Lord. Here I go, weak and low,
Pinza was a surprisingly untemperamental artist. The nearest he came to making trouble was at a concert when he addressed a small child in the front row with the words, "Little boy, please to stop waggle your foot, it interfere with my tempo." Pinza's friend and compatriot, the famous lyric soprano Licia Albanese, can only recall one incident when his temper snapped on stage.
When he was doing Colline, which is a philosopher, he lost his patience about opening the champagne bottle. all the time we had real champagne, because people, they had the winery, they used to bring so much. But on the second act, there is that dinner at Montmartre, at Café Momus. So, and then he started to open this, couldn't take the cork out, couldn't, pull. Then he said a very bad word and left the pot in the middle of the table and said, now you do yourself. But he said a very bad, in dialect, Bolognese, I think. So then they used to say not a very bad word, but we had to laugh, because bad words makes you laugh a lot.
Pinza's operatic repertoire was extensive and varied. It embraced Mussorgsky's Boris, sung in Italian, and several Wagnerian parts as well. And for a star of his magnitude, he was remarkably ready to undertake the less spectacular roles. Ramphis, Sparafucile, Colline, the Comte de Grieux in Manon and the like. Though, as Albanese says, when he sang them, the roles were not small roles anymore. Eventually, after 22 seasons and 833 performances with the Metropolitan Company, though his voice was still in splendid shape, Pinza decided that the time had come to turn his back on the demands of grand opera. And in 1949 he created the role of Emile de Becque in the Rodgers and Hammerstein musical South Pacific, opposite the Broadway star Mary Martin. It was the biggest gamble of his career, and inevitably in certain quarters there was talk of him prostituting his art. This was not a view shared, however, by his colleagues at the Met, who knew how much a singer likes to sing and a performer likes to perform. His old friends flocked to the Majestic Theatre, Rhys Stevens amongst them.
I couldn't wait to go to hear it, because I knew this certain thing that he had would be there, and it sure was. I mean, no matter who was with him, Martin or anybody else that sang with him on that stage, he was there. That was Ezio. And that gorgeous sound came out.
Some enchanted evening, you may see a stranger, across a crowded room, and somehow you know even then, that somewhere you see her again and again. Some enchanted evening, someone may be laughing, you may hear her laughing across a crowded room, and night after night, as strange as it seems, the sound of her laughter will sing in your dreams. Who can explain it? Who can tell you why? Fools give you reasons, wise men never try. Some enchanted evening, when you find her through, when you feel her call you across a crowded room, then fly to her side and make her your own. For all through your life you may dream once you have found her, never let her go. Once you have found her, never let her go.
The transition from grand opera to so-called lighter music isn't necessarily an easy one to make. Although in musicals the sound is always amplified and the instrumental accompaniment is considerably less formidable than a full operatic orchestra, there are other problems to cope with. John Fernley, a member of the original South Pacific production team.
Dick Rogers had worked with Ezio's vocal accompanist to find out where his voice was strongest, because they said he's going to have to sing 8 performances a week, which no opera singer has ever done, and the music will lie right within his range. So they found, note bottom and note top, and where the tessitura was perfect for Ezio Pinza. And it worked also for quite a while. That it was quite a long time before he missed a performance.
And how did show business folk react to having Ezio Pinza in their midst?
Well, he was a very, very exciting opera star, and the mere fact that he was going to be in a musical comedy on Broadway was terribly exciting, and it was. It was an electric experience for the company from the moment we went with the show. He was not a temperamental man at all. He was terribly nice, as a matter of fact, to people. There was nothing unpleasant star, don't speak to me unless I speak to you, about him. He also had humor and very, very light moments, as in the early part of the finale of Act One, where he and Mary are drinking champagne together and waltzing together, and where they dance and carry on. And there's a delicacy or a lightness to this big man at that time that's very touching. He was a moving man, and I don't think anybody's ever touched him in that part.
Pinza's Émile de Becque won him every available show business award, and he found himself shortly before his 57th birthday being feted as the most glamorous male star on Broadway. As one newspaper put it, Pinza took the theatre away from the boys and gave it back to the men. And in the words of Licia Albanese, Broadway got a taste of really great singing, and grand opera came a little bit out of its shell. A new career opened up for Pinza. After more than a year in South Pacific came 3 Hollywood films, his own television series, and regular guest spots on other people's radio shows. In 1954, Pinza returned to Broadway to play the role of César in Fanny, a musical by Harold Rome, which combined the plots of the Marcel Pagnol film trilogy, Marius, Fanny, and César. The Herald Tribune's reviewer was not particularly impressed by the show, but he was by Ezio Pinza. The colour, the warmth, the command, he wrote, all come from this mature and magnificent personality.
Marius, this has been a very important step in our lives. We have finally talked to each other. Sometimes you wait to say things, you wait too late. Days that once seemed so slow, how fast they go. You have often heard me say that children are the poison of a parent's existence. But Marius, it cannot be entirely true, because my son, no matter what you decide to do, or why you do it, I like you.
Ezio Pinza and William Tabbitt in a brief excerpt from Fanny, which turned out to be Pinza's swan song on the musical stage. Shortly before his 65th birthday, he died of a heart attack at his home in Stamford, Connecticut. His unique position in the musical life of America was reflected in the choice of honorary pallbearers at his funeral. From Broadway, Richard Rodgers, Oscar Hammerstein, and the director of South Pacific, Joshua Logan. And from the Met, Edward Johnson, the retired general manager. Pinza had won the admiration of an extraordinarily broad spectrum of the public. But but I fancy that, like most people in the world of music, it would be the admiration of his colleagues on which he himself would have set the highest value. Colleagues like Patrice Mansell.
The way he sang those songs and this deep, wonderful sound that came out of him that was more than singing. It was the essence of whatever he was doing, the essence of the music, the essence of the character. And it was just a thrilling experience that I am so grateful for, and I know that no one ever will take his place.
Finca dal vino calda la testa, una gran festa fa preparar. Se trovi in piazza qualche ragazza, te con quella cerca menar, te con quella cerca menar, cerca menar, cerca menar. Senza un ordine la danza sia, il minuetto, chi la folia, chi la lemanna fare ballar, chi il minuetto fare ballar, chi la folia fare ballar, chi la lemanna fare ballar. Ed io frattanto dall'altro canto, con questa e quella vuoi moreggiar, vuoi moreggiar, vuoi moreggiar. La mia lista domani mattina ad una decina devi aumentar. Alla mia lista ad una decina devi aumentar. Se trovi in piazza qualche ragazza e con quella cerca menor. Oh, la mia lista domani mattina ad una decina devi aumentar. Senza alcun ordine la danza sia, il minuetto, chi la folia, chi la levanna fare ballare. La mia lista domani mattina ad una decina devi aumentar. Una decina devi aumentar. Una decina devi aumentar. Devi aumentar, devi aumentar. Devi aumentar.
Ezio Pinza singing Fin Can Vino from Mozart's Don Giovanni, bringing to an end this centenary celebration of his life and work. It was written and presented by Nigel Douglas. The interviews in New York were recorded by Andrew Blackman, and the programme was produced in Manchester by Gillian Hush.